For those of you who are interested, starting this Wednesday, which is tomorrow, golly, yep, we're at already midweek. I will be doing a Facebook Live at 9 a.m. on Wednesday mornings on the CMHA of New Brunswick Facebook page. In that one, I'll be talking a little bit about kind of the changing world we're living in. What's it like to be, moving back into kind of a reintegration of the economy and healthcare and so on. Finding some coping skills if you're feeling nervous or apprehensive about that, and so on. So we'll be doing some work around there and really engaging in some intentional acts of hope as well. So it looks like the addition of participants has kind of slowed down in the last 90 seconds or so. It looks like we're at about 18 folks on the call, including myself. So let's get started with talking about session 3, exposure and desensitization. So in the first 2 sessions, we talked about, let me get my mouse going here. We talked about, in week 1, we talked about anxiety, vulnerability management, kind of the anxiety 101. And last week, we talked about relaxation and mindfulness. And I encourage you to really incorporate some relaxation skills. We talked about progressive muscle relaxation and so on, and breathing, the diaphragmatic breathing. And so I've encouraged you to really incorporate more of that into your daily lives. So this week, we're going to be talking about how to avoid avoidance. And that's really interesting, right? And our behaviors can actually make our anxiety worse. And it's important that we know how to overcome that. Exposure. One of my favorite quotations is from Eleanor Roosevelt, who said, "Do one thing every day that scares you." And that can be something small or large. Perhaps it's trying a new recipe. Maybe it's making that phone call. My golly, maybe it's swiping left on Tinder. Is it right or left? I don't actually know. But whatever it is, do one thing that scares you a little bit. One thing that makes you go, oof, can I actually do this? And it's really important that we embrace that notion that not all things that are scary to us, that we perceive as scary, are actually bad. And we're going to spend some time talking about that today. So, excuse me. We're going to be spending some time talking about how desensitization ultimately works to kind of retrain our anxiety alarm. And we talked so on, and we'll be learning how and when to use exposure as a technique for combating our anxiety, for retraining that anxiety alarm. And we're going to learn some really important rules about how and when to do this and what to follow to make sure we get the best results from using exposure and desensitization. And I'm going to try to give you a few examples that would make sense for you so you really understand not just how to do it, but what it looks like in the process. In other words, I really want you to find some comfort in the idea of exposure, which, when you hear that word, may feel a little bit scary, as Eleanor Roosevelt says. So what is exposure? Have you ever been afraid of something and found out that your fear became less and less intense over time the more you experienced it? For example, perhaps you've been afraid of flying, and the more you fly, the easier it becomes. I'm trying to think of something that I was afraid of. I used to actually be really afraid of the water, of the ocean. And the more and more I spent time at the ocean and around the ocean, the more I loved it. And in fact, loved it so much that I became a qualified sea kayaking guide, and I lived on a sailboat and raced sailboats. So sometimes our fear can become lessened through exposure. So the more that we do something, this is kind of how exposure works, or at least partially. And often the more that we do something that we are afraid of doing, or exposed to something of which we are afraid, the less afraid we tend to be. This is just one of the skills that we can use for CBT, just one. And with exposure, we kind of gradually begin doing some of the things that we tend to avoid, or we take away the unhelpful efforts to really stay safe, or in our minds safe. Especially, we want to do these things if we need to do them in order to reach some specific personal goals. So the good news is that not only are we more likely to reach those goals when we use exposure, But by doing these exposure exercises, the anxiety can actually be lessened and we feel better. We have a greater sense of confidence, a greater sense of esteem. And when we feel better, it's because our anxiety center, the amygdala, which is like, I keep pointing at the back of my head, but it's kind of like, because it's sort of, you can't really point at it. It's because the amygdala is getting less and less sensitive to the trigger, to the activator. And that desensitization part. And this is a really complicated, albeit unconscious, learning process that happens in our brain. The key to this all is to put ourselves into the situation where the amygdala can learn through the experience and can learn that what it expects to happen doesn't actually always happen. And I think it's really important that we understand the difference between expectations and actuality. So here's an example. Let's assume that a taxi driver has a fear of traveling over bridges, okay? And this driver avoids bridges at all costs. Will even pull over to the side of the road with a passenger in the car, with a fare in the car, pretend to have engine trouble in order to avoid a bridge. That's pretty severe. This particular fear is now impacting his ability to do his job, right? It's impacting her quality of life. With the help of a therapist, this driver, this taxi driver, this Uber driver, what have you, learns to gradually beat this fear, starting by going over like really low bridges with a friend in the passenger seat, eventually working up to driving over larger and larger and larger bridges entirely on their own. That would be kind of one example of what exposure might look like. Or let's assume that maybe Bill, we'll call him Bill. I was trying to think of a good like neutral name. I couldn't come up with anything. Bill. Bill is a college student, has a tremendous fear of public speaking. And that's a very common fear, okay? It's a very common apprehension. So much so that Bill really tries to avoid taking any classes that involve oral presentations, even group ones. And then when he does have one of those classes, he tries to avoid the presentations by missing class, so thereby taking a lower grade, and often fails to complete his work as a result, and generally performs more poorly in those classes where there's an oral presentation component. Now, because he knows this is problematic, Bill is seeking out treatment to help, right? He's seeing the campus counselor. He wants to learn to speak in front of actual process. And through therapy, he does gradually learn to speak in front of a few people, then small groups, then larger groups, and then ultimately really large audiences. This practice allows him to become more and more comfortable with speaking in front of others. Does this mean that he actively seeks this thing? Not necessarily, no. But it means that if he has to do it, he can do it with comfort, without dis-ease or unease. So when do we use exposure? When is it something that is appropriate? Well, exposure doesn't work for all types of anxiety all the time. There are things we really need to know before starting to use exposure, as with any other therapeutic modality. We hope that by the end of today's session, you'll have a little better understanding of when exposure therapy can be helpful and how to use it. So to get a sense of when to use it, ask yourself these questions that you see on your screen. Do I know what's triggering my anxiety? And if you recall in the first session, I encouraged you to write down some of those things that activate or trigger your anxiety. Ask yourself, is there something important to me that I am avoiding because of the anxiety? So, maybe I was missing out on opportunities to go sailing with friends or spend time with family members who love the water because of my fear. Ask yourself, are there times when I try to stay safe or protect myself, which then may affect my ability to live the life I want to? These are really great questions to ask yourself. This is an opportunity. And when we do this, we want to, review those anxiety triggers from the first week, and to help you really determine what is at the root of that apprehension, at the root of that anxiety or fear. Sometimes it really is helpful to get the help of an experienced professional mental health care provider to learn more about your triggers, to learn more about the activators and where they come from or why they show up. So as you recall, we did a session 2 sessions ago where we included information around our anxiety fuel. One of the things that we learned there is that avoidance and safety behaviors can actually make our anxiety worse. And so it can be really helpful to review your particular anxiety fuels before beginning any exposure exercises. So it would be helpful maybe to review session 1 for that. As a rule of thumb, safety and avoidance behaviors, pardon me, interfere with the improvement that we might experience by using exposure. So it's really important that we're tuned in to what those are. And a little bit later in this session today, we'll talk more about how safety behaviors can actually fully get in the way of our progress with exposure. So just some quick take-homes about exposure in general. Exposure is basically just one of the many important skill sets found in cognitive behavioral therapy. It's just one of. It works best when we know what triggers or activates our anxiety, and when we are aware of both our avoidance and safety behaviors that we use when anxiety presents itself. And the goal of exposure is to gradually, and remember that word, gradually, expose ourselves to whatever it is that we're avoiding, which then helps us reduce the anxiety and make progress toward our more positive life goals. So a lot of you might be wondering, oof, that seems like kind of a scary thing to be doing. So the question is, should you do exposure? You know, facing our fears is scary. It is. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to be disingenuous and say, oh no, it's a piece of cake. It's a walk in the park. It's not. It's scary, and it's really stinking hard work. And it is really common for folks to question whether or not they should do exposure to reduce anxiety and stop avoiding important things. Before and during exposure, we really need to remind ourselves of why we're seeking treatment in the first place. It can be really helpful to consider, you know, how avoiding things inconveniences us, how it negatively impacts us, how it keeps us from achieving positive life goals. So if we think about our college student, public speaker, Bill, he could make a list if he wanted. So make a list of the ways that avoidance impacts his life. Avoiding public speaking impacts his life in these ways. He starts to worry about the next speech. He has to really juggle his schedule and actively look for quotations. He notes that when he does speak in public, he feels super anxious. He may recognize that he sometimes fails classes that involve public speaking. He may limit the types of careers for himself because he's unable to speak in public. And he may not be able to actually move up or progress in his career as a result of not being able to speak in public, of avoiding that public speaking. So when we write down and really think about, really think about the way that avoidance impacts our lives, this can help us understand why it's important to stop avoiding. And we can use exposure to work on the avoiding itself. All right. So here's a little activity for you. I hope you have your notepads. I hope you have your pens and paper ready. So this is a question. How can you use exposure? So first thing you do is think about that first session when you wrote down your anxiety triggers. Review that list. Ask, am I avoiding any of these triggers because of anxiety? Ask, are there times when I'm exposed to these triggers and I try to stay safe or protect myself, which may then affect my ability to live my life the way I want to? So you're taking note of these things. Now list out some of the triggers for which the answers to those questions are yes. Okay? So, oh yeah, this trigger, check. Oh yeah, check, check, check. So really, this is a great opportunity to kind of merge the skills that we've been learning from the beginning. And that's part of the point of this, is that we're doing it in chunks so that we can take this skill that we learned, add this one on top of it, and then add this one. It's like, you know, therapy lasagna. We need all the layers together. That's a very strange analogy. So here's an example. If we look at Bill, college student, he would write down these things. This is how yours might look. So if it's, you avoid large crowds, or family dinners, or you avoid places where there might be dogs, and so on. You would write down the various things that either inconvenience you or keeps you from achieving your goals. And so this is how your list might look. So that's exposure. But let's talk a little bit about desensitization. So we'll talk about desensitization and inhibitory learning. So you may remember when we talked about anxiety fuel a couple sessions ago, that we can think and do things that make the anxiety worse, like thinking over and over and over, right? Ruminating or worrying what might happen when we have to make a speech, or avoiding speeches altogether. Anxiety can also get worse when bad things really happen, or when we perceive that some event is dangerous. And as mentioned earlier, bad events, safety behaviors, and negative thoughts or predictions, remember we talked about mental filters, can actually make our anxiety alarm much more sensitive to certain triggers. And this is called sensitization. Okay, so hang on, that's called sensitization, when we're more sensitive to certain triggers as a result of actually experiencing bad events, engaging in safety behaviors, or negative thoughts, beliefs, and predictions. So if you recall last session, we talked about a person who has a fear of spiders. So desensitization is the complete opposite of sensitization. In desensitization, our amygdala, the anxiety fear center, learns that something is not dangerous, and it learns that it is not dangerous enough to actually change our lives because of it. This happens through experience. So take the spider example. If this guy continues to approach the spider, he is teaching the amygdala that the spider is not as dangerous as he once thought. The thought goes, if approaching that spider, if he's approaching that spider, it must not be dangerous. Therefore, there's less of a big alarm going off. So in the opposite, if every time he sees a spider, he averts, avoids, turns the other way, runs, does something that is avoidant, he's teaching the amygdala, ooh, this is danger. Okay, so there's a very kind of simple example of what that looks like. What we're effectively doing through inhibitory learning is that we're rewiring our brains. We're retraining, creating new learning, okay? So what it means in inhibitory learning means that by doing things over and over, especially things that our amygdala fears or perceives as dangerous or threatening, we are actually developing new learning pathways in the brain that inhibit the amygdala from sending the fear messages to the body to start the fight, flight, freeze response. And it's really important to note at this point that these new pathways do not replace or erase the old ones. They compete with them. Okay, so in other words, the original learning of, ooh, this spider is dangerous is still recorded as a memory in the brain. It's still there, it's not gone. But the more we practice not avoiding, the stronger the new pathways become. So these new pathways will eventually become the default pathways, which means that you would more automatically experience the trigger as less dangerous and would not have that same urge to avoid. It's like the new pathways are continuously communicating to the amygdala, hey, this is not dangerous enough to actually avoid, or it could be dangerous, but you're totally able to handle it, or you know what, it's a little anxiety inducing, but it's not going to last forever. This is what the new pathways are teaching or telling the amygdala. Interestingly, we don't actually have to try to think those things. The brain learns automatically through the experience itself. Just do it, as Nike says, just do it, and the brain will do the work for you, which is really cool, right? Our brains are plastic, and neuroplasticity is a remarkably cool thing. one thing to remember when we're talking about inhibitory learning, and if we're talking about exposure therapy, is that it does take time. It's not something like that, okay? It takes time to retrain the brain. It takes time to retrain the amygdala to believe that something is not dangerous, especially if it has become ingrained. You've been training the amygdala for years and years to believe that this thing is dangerous. Pardon me, I just fell over in my chair there. And as we're going to talk about a little bit later today, one important thing about exposure therapy is to practice it over and over and over again in various contexts, regardless of whether the anxiety level changes in any given session. That's interesting. Since our amygdala is designed and wants to protect us, it needs a lot of convincing to eventually be willing to turn that anxiety alarm down. Okay, I have a couple of dogs. Stella is just a big old baby. She's loud, but she's just a big old baby. Kona is a border collie lab. She's a farm dog. Her instinct is to protect the herd. So when strangers arrive at the farm, she barks at them and she circles around them because her instinct is to protect. Now, she doesn't bite, she doesn't cause harm, but it takes her a little bit of time and practice and good reinforcement to understand this person is not a threat, or this group of people are not threats to the herd. It requires practice. It doesn't happen immediately because she's trained to protect her herd. If we think about the amygdala in that way, and we understand that the old fear learning is still there in the brain, we can never completely assume that we won't feel afraid of the trigger in the future. So just like Kona, if she hasn't seen those people in a while, or they come at her from a different perspective, a different angle, she may still bark at them and circle them, wondering why they're there. What we can do is keep practicing those skills. We can keep practicing and practicing and practicing until our automatic reactions to the fear will be to face it instead of avoid it and not let it run our lives. And as this happens, the fear that we experience will feel less distressing and it'll feel less uncomfortable over time. But it does practice. So the key takeaways through experience over time, experience plus time, we can train our brains to be less sensitive, desensitized, to certain. This process is called desensitization, and that happens through that learning process called inhibitory learning. Okay, great, kind of this equals this. So some examples. How do we think about that? Well, imagine, if you will, because we're Canadian, imagine that you were asked to sing "O Canada" in both official languages at the NHL season opener. Would you be nervous? Would you feel overwhelmed, apprehensive? Probably, maybe. And what if then you were asked to do this for every single home game for the entire season, and for the NHL, so like 41 games? Would you be just as nervous after 1 month? After, we get to mid-season? At the end of the season? Playoffs? What would happen? Think about that. How would that change for you? So let's imagine we have a fictitious character named Elaine. And I may have come up with this example whilst watching Seinfeld. I don't know, because that's where the name came from. Elaine, let's assume, grew up in northern New Brunswick. And her family lived rurally and experienced many, many severe winter storms. Welcome to New Brunswick. So she learned that through experience that although winter storms are inconvenient rather, they're not convenient. Oh my golly, I should be drinking coffee, not water, apparently. Through experience, Elaine became conditioned to believe that winter storms are inconvenient, but they tend to not be too dangerous if you're prepared, if you know what to do. And when she'd see something on the news about a storm that caused people to complain or be fearful, she'd think, well, odd, right? Because in her experience, winter storms were not particularly dangerous. They were inconvenient. A storm that caused, extreme property damage or loss of life would seem to Elaine like an isolated incident, like that, once in 100-year storm. And it truly didn't change her opinion of how dangerous winter storms could be. Right? That's her conditioning. Jessica, on the other hand, grew up in the southern US. When she was very little, say 6 years old, she saw a news clip in which a freak winter storm on the eastern seaboard caused massive power outages, caused loss of refrigeration, thawing and flooding, ice damage, power lines down, road accidents, etc. And she got the impression from that at a very young age that snowstorms were inherently dangerous. As an adult, through her work, she was contracted to go work in a northern area. Every time she saw a winter advisory, a forecast that called for a winter storm, she remembered that news clip. And she began to get that, that rush. And she began to worry that she could be in danger. She felt scared and anxious when she had to drive in winter weather. The next year, her friend, Rachel, okay, so we have friends, Rachel, that's where I went there, wasn't it? Invited her on a ski vacation in Quebec. And Jessica gradually learned through her experience there that winter storms, that snowstorms, although sometimes inconvenient, were not always dangerous and in fact could be enjoyable. And she began to feel less afraid. And as she embraced the sport of skiing, she became less and less and less afraid and apprehensive of winter storms. So you see how that can work, right? So that's a But you might be thinking, like, I've exposed myself to this particular trigger over and over again for a long time, okay? Kerri, put the brakes on. It hasn't gotten any better. In fact, it's actually getting worse. So what the heck? Why would exposure make this any better for me? Well, there are some very specific and important rules for exposure that are necessary in order for it to work. And we're going to talk about those rules and tips in a moment. So let's take an exercise. Try to think of some things to which you've become desensitized in your life. Maybe it's driving, a scary movie, roller coasters. That's one for me. I used to be terrified of roller coasters, air travel, et cetera, et cetera. So think of those things. And then think about things at which you've gotten good at doing or experiencing with some practice. So maybe some fears that you've overcome by being exposed to them over and over, perhaps unintentionally. Then write them down. What comes to mind? Well, I think roller coasters. I think, water. I think, maybe driving in a city. If you're not from a city, getting accustomed to driving in a large urban area. Different kinds of things. So have a look at that and think about what that looks like for you. So this tells you that you've done it already, but unconsciously, right? That you actually already have the skill. You just don't realize that you've been doing it. So how do you get started on exposure intentionally, deliberately? Well, we know how desensitization and inhibitory learning work. So let's start. Ask yourself, should I do exposure, right? Okay, so go back to where we were a few minutes ago. Review your note around should I do it. Remember that if you are currently engaged in avoidance or safety behaviors related to a trigger, it is possible and likely that using exposure could be helpful to bring down the anxiety related to them. So getting started, right? So how do you know where to start? Again, this is self-reflective. You need to ask yourself specific questions. If different anxiety triggers If different anxiety triggers interfere with your life and you're just not sure where to start, ask yourself these questions that you see on the screen. Which triggers are interfering the most with my life? Okay, so this thing causes me a lot of distress. Which anxiety triggers would improve my life the most if they were improved? Okay, going through the list. Oh yeah, that one. Does one particular thing stand out as being more doable, more accessible to you than others? Would there be one that's easier to start on so you can get your life back on track? So sometimes it's a good idea to pick an easy one, right? And then pick out the most pertinent exposure target. And once you've chosen a trigger to work on, I want you to actually, and this may seem counterintuitive, but it's important. I want you to actually think about and list, really write it out, ways in which you might be able to trigger your anxiety, get that anxiety alarm going. For example, if we go back to Bill, the college student who doesn't like to speak in public, he might write down different types of situations that would trigger his public speaking anxiety. When we do this, this is called either a stimuli map or a fear hierarchy. I'm going to pull up Bill's example here. So you can see here, he has the exposure exercise. So this is different ways to trigger his anxiety. So speaking in front of a large group of professionals who are experts on the topic. Oof, that would be a big one, right? Or speaking in front of a large group of professionals who are experts on the topic on which I'm speaking, using an impromptu style and a few note cards. That's a big one for Bill. Speaking about himself in front of a group of friends, or a few people he doesn't know and who don't know his topic, and so on. So what you're going to do in this case is not just look at what the trigger is, you're then going to rate it on a scale of either 0 to 10 or 0 to 100. And I see there's something up in the chat here, just a second. These triggers, whoops. I just went. Would these be triggers in general or triggers which cause us to avoid? In general, so this would be going back to what are the things that trigger your anxiety. All right, so we're going to look at on the right-hand side, or my right-hand side of the screen. I don't know if it's reversed on yours. The anxiety rating is based on either a scale of 0 to 10, as I said, or 0 to 100. Active units of distress scale, SUDS, and it's really a helpful scale for determining our level of anxiety. So if you have a look here at this next image, you can see that, we kind of scale it on the sense of, 100 being the highest anxiety you've ever felt, and 0 being like no anxiety at all, just, alert and awake, kind of very chill. So, and it's a full range. Usually in therapy, we'll use this to help rate the amount of anxiety someone is having during an exposure exercise. It's kind of like a thermometer. As it creeps up, it's more dangerous, it's less healthy, less helpful, and it is something that can be really helpful for you to kind of take note of your own experience. So just kind of, if you have a template for a blank thermometer, or just write a scale of 0 to 100 or 0 to 10, and figure out where you sit for any given activity or trigger. Why do we rate our anxiety? Well, this is a really great place because it gives us a baseline, right? And these are some of the reasons why using a scale or rating your anxiety is so helpful before exposure treatment, is it does give us that baseline. It helps us to decide where to start so that we can see, how we're moving from one exposure exercise to the next one to the next one. It helps us keep track of our progress to really kind of visually see how our anxiety is changing over a period of time, over a progression. Gives us an opportunity to step back kind of objectively and see that our anxiety is not always the same level of severity. And it helps us to activate that part of the brain, the thinking part of our brain. So it's a really great tool for all of those reasons. And if you're a visual learner or a visual processor, this could be really helpful too. So here's the thing, for doing your own fear hierarchy, I'm having trouble with my mouse here. Fear hierarchy, start by picking a trigger, something that activates you. And then you're going to try to design your own exposure exercise by listing those possible ways to bring on the anxiety. Okay, so this is different ways to bring on the anxiety. And you're going to rate that on a scale of 0 to 10. I'm not doing it yet. We're just writing it down. We're just coming up with the ideas. Okay, and exposure practice really is, it's a formula. Okay, there are certain ingredients that are necessary for it to be helpful, like baking bread. You know, I've got bread on almost every day. If we don't have all of the ingredients, we don't follow all of the rules, we're less likely to make progress. In fact, we can make it much worse. And in exposure, there are 4 kind of key ingredients: repetitive practice, focusing on anxiety feelings, adding no safety behaviors, and finding ways to learn something new by violating the amygdala's expectations or predictions of fear. I see my Microsoft Office PowerPoint did a funny little line there. So these are the 4 steps: repetitive practice, focusing on anxiety feelings, adding no safety behaviors, and finding ways to learn something new by challenging or violating the expectations of the amygdala's fear predictor. Those are the 4 basic ingredients. Just like baking a loaf of bread, you know, water, sugar, warm water, sugar, yeast, flour, salt. And if we don't have all of those ingredients, we're not going to get a loaf of bread. So let's have a look at ingredient number 1, repetition. We have a piano. We have a new piano in our house. Want to play, but we've told them they're not going to be good at it unless they practice, practice, practice. Repetition. That's why we do, when we're learning a musical instrument, we do scales. We do those exercises over and over again. That's why when we play a sport, we do drills, right? We do those running drills. And everybody's like, but I want to play soccer. Well, you know, running up and down the soccer pitch is part of building a skill. Repetition is important for our brain to learn anything new, and anxiety and exposure is no different. We need to practice. We need that repetition. And most people will find that it takes consistent daily practice to adequately retrain the brain to feel better. This is just the way it works. So ingredient number 2 is our focus on the anxiety feelings. This is the part that can be really difficult, okay? And this is the kind of the icky part. We're going to ask you, challenge you, encourage you on the feelings that come up when you're in the anxiety-provoking situation. So is it fear? Is it apprehension? Is it anger? Is it discomfort? And why do we do this? Because we are trying to convince the amygdala that this trigger is not actually dangerous. If we avoid these unpleasant feelings completely, if we stuff them down, then we are sending the message, in fact, that the trigger is dangerous, and our time spent practicing exposure has been wasted. It's why do we even bother? So this focus on the present experience during exposure activates and strengthens the part of the brain that inhibits the amygdala, that middle portion of the prefrontal cortex. There's my dog. Sorry about that. She decided to join us today. Sorry, ingredient number 3, no safety behaviors. I'm going to answer your question here, Patrina. So no safety behaviors. So what do we do here? So if we spent our entire exposure practice trying to stay safe or protect ourselves from the trigger or the anxiety itself, it's the same thing. We're going to not be effective. We're not going to experience the benefit of the exposure. And you may remember from session 1 that safety behaviors are a great way to fuel our anxiety and make it stronger. And they ultimately sabotage our exposure practice. So some of these, behaviors they'll be unique to the individual, but avoidance, stuffing things down. Oh, my other dog just came in. Okay, sorry. We got dogs everywhere today. So you may want to look at some of your anxiety fuel or your triggers, your safety behaviors. Okay, it's another part of doing things correctly. Don't be sorry, love the dog. The more dogs, the better, thanks. Yeah, wait until they start barking. You may not be so thrilled. So that's Stella. She's a rescue. She's a Great Dane mix with, we're not really sure what. We think probably goat or shark or something. So safety behaviors, we're going to try to not use them, simply experience. Oh, good, Hannah, thank you. We're going to simply experience the anxiety. We're going to experience, the feelings. And that's really an important piece. And remember, we talked about mindfulness in the relaxation session last week, that being present and being really connected to the moment is part of getting better. So ingredient number 4 is a little trickier. So we've done repetition, we've done feel the feelings, and we've done that, like, no safety behaviors. But number 4 is to violate the expectations of the amygdala's fear predictions. That's a mouthful, right? This can be confusing. And this is a part that really often will require the intervention and work with a trained professional. And the key element in this section is to understand what the anxiety is saying. And give your brain a chance to learn through experience that this prediction doesn't have to come true and doesn't always come true. So an example might be, let me just think. I'm not going to be able to tolerate this anxiety. Just a simple statement. I'm not going to be able to tolerate this anxiety. But make the exposure to the activator, to the trigger, prolonged enough to allow you to see if this is actually the case, if you actually can't tolerate it. Most people will find that exposure can help you learn that they can, in fact, tolerate anxiety. And when this is the case, we begin to perceive the anxiety as being less powerful or uncomfortable. We take away its power. Exposure builds confidence. It builds resilience, which then, if we look forward thinking, helps us with challenging experiences and emotions in the future. So if we can tolerate it in the moment, we're building that resilience that allows it to tolerate it in the future. Okay, so we're carrying here. I'm sure that we're being respectful of everyone's time. How are we doing? 11:45. Whew. Okay, let's keep soldiering on. Everybody still okay? So some of the take homes from exposure. Exposure, number one factor. Period. The number one factor in seeing improvement with exposure is whether or not you actually do the exposure, and whether or not you use all 4 ingredients. Okay, there it is. That's the most important thing. So that exposure practice requires repetitive exposures to the things we fear, focusing on the anxiety feelings. Feel the feelings. Oh, Stella's feeling the feelings right now. Avoid the safety behaviors, and look to violate our amygdala's fear predictors, what the amygdala has been trained to expect will happen. And more of this later, okay? So let's talk about violating the expectations or retraining the brain. Well, I've already told you that our brains are kind of plastic, right? Neuroplasticity is a thing. One of the ways, one of the important ways that we can retrain the brain is to figure out what the anxiety is trying to say to us. What is it trying to say is the feared outcome? And then set ourselves up to learn something new about that feared trigger. So this is important, as exposure is not as simple as just do it over and over and over again, and then the anxiety just goes away because it's desensitized. It's not that simple. If our brain doesn't learn anything new, it's well, it's just practicing old learned fear patterns, right? Like, so if we don't learn something new about it, then we're just reinforcing the pre-existing fear. So what are some examples of anxiety-based expectations where we can learn to compete with the old information? So challenge the old information with new. So remember I said that when we add new memories, they're not replacing the old, they're competing with to try to win. And these relationships between expectations, old learning, and new learning are really important to consider when you're thinking about your exposure practice. So I've got a little graphic here for you. So let's have a look. So we start with, what does the amygdala expect? So let's have a look. I will fall apart if this. What can be learned through our experience, through this exposure experience, is when bad things happen, I can hold things together. In fact, I might even grow from it. An automatic expectation or previous learned experience, I cannot cause someone else pain of any kind. Can't do that, it's terrible. Whereas if we go through learned experience, we can say, you know, causing others pain is inevitable. It's not my job to protect others from pain. Most people tend to cope with pain. Or if I'm myself, people won't like me. Well, if people don't like me, it's not the end of the world. I can find people that like me just as I am. If I don't avoid that, I'll screw up. You know, I might make some mistakes here and there, but generally when I'm assertive, things work out. So you can see there's all of these kind of, this is my expectation, here's the new learned experience. This is hard. This is hard work because our brains have been so conditioned to believe that automatic negative thought. You know what, if I do this thing, I'm not going to be able to handle the rejection. New learned thought, I can handle this. I'll be okay, right? And it's just really hard to get there. Here's some more examples about anxiety itself. If I confront the source of my anxiety, the anxiety will never go away. The actual new learned behavior is, you know what, anxiety changes over time. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, right? Or if I confront it, it will be intolerable. No, actually, I'm able to tolerate anxiety. If I confront it, I'll go crazy, I'll explode. I might feel bad, might feel uncomfortable, but I'm not going to explode. If I experience panic, I'm going to suffocate, I'm going to die, I'm going to pass out. I'm actually not going to pass out or suffocate, even if it feels like I might. So it's really important that we start to unlearn a lot of our old behaviors. Caveat. We logically know, and we need to own, that there is no way to completely prevent bad things from happening in the future, right? Because, you know, it's the world. We're humans. The way it is. We cannot completely prevent any bad things from happening. No exposure exercise can get us away from that particular anxiety loophole. Yeah, you know, nothing bad happened this time. Happen, right? And we've all done that thing. We've all done that. And we may have noticed that many of the expectations listed, you know, just in those two examples I gave you, are about us as individuals and about our ability to manage emotions. It's true. We cannot prevent bad things from happening. We cannot. Excuse me. We cannot stop bad things from happening. What we can do is choose how to respond. And before all of, you know, you've joined in on these sessions, you may have been in a reactive space when it comes to anxiety, but now you're having the opportunity to retrain and to choose how to respond to bad events. And it can often be a better investment in self to prove to yourself how you can handle stressors in the future, rather than to pin, you know, a false hope on bad things never happening. So build your resilience, right? There's that word again, resilience. So ask yourself, you know, how does this actually work? How does all of this come together? So the key to remember with expectation violations, when we're challenging the amygdala, is to understand what your predictions are. So ask yourself, like, what is the absolute worst case scenario? And I know that sometimes we think, well, I shouldn't think about those things. I'm going to challenge you to do that. Think about it. What is the absolute worst case scenario? and then write down what you believe, what your anxiety is predicting will happen. Write it down. Then do the exposure. And this can be seen as like a behavioral experiment, a test to see what actually happens. So the trick here is to stay in the situation, stay in the circumstances long enough for the expectation of the amygdala, that fear, that negative anticipation, to be disproved, to be violated. In other words, stay in the situation long enough until you learn something new about the feared trigger. I can already hear you, but what if this doesn't happen, right? Okay. If that doesn't happen, check in with yourself, be reflective, and go through. Am I following all the other rules of exposure? Am I doing the things in the order that I need to? And if something really bad does happen, recognize that it becomes a choice of how to react to it, how to respond to it. The question might be, given the danger that this really poses, what is my choice about how to move forward, given all of my life goals, all of my aims? And we keep trying and we keep experimenting. And sometimes it takes a really long time. And I don't want to make anybody think that it happens immediately after 2 or 3 tries, okay? Sometimes it takes a really long time to understand what we really fear, what's at the heart of the anxiety, the root of the anxiety, and how to retrain those particular expectations, which is why if your anxiety has long history, deep-seated roots, it's important to work with a trained mental health professional to help you get there, to help you challenge the amygdala, right? Because that's where it can be tricky. So, what are some tips for exposure? Follow the rules, okay? Follow the rules of exposure. As I've already discussed and already emphasized, it's really important that all of the ingredients are included in order to get optimal results. I can make bread without salt, but it's not ideal. It doesn't have the same result. The number one factor determining whether or not someone does well with exposure is whether or not they have consistently practiced and consistently followed the rules, included all of the ingredients. Go for that violation. Go for it. I can't stress this enough. Go for it. This is more important than whether or not the anxiety gets better within an exposure set, within the context of that exposure session, or even between sessions. The challenging of the expectations, the violation of them, is part of the new learning. It's creating those new neural pathways which help us, right? And it's not necessarily connected to quick changes in anxiety symptoms. It's long-term. Okay. Then we want to vary the exposure to get the best, the most long-lasting results. It's important to mix it up, right? The exposure needs to be shifted, changed as much as possible. So there are different ways to do this. So this could be different lengths of time. Sometimes the exposure is prolonged, sometimes it's shorter. The exposure happening in different contexts. This is really important because exposure in one context does not always generalize to other contexts. Maybe I'm really comfortable speaking in front of my classmates in my classroom that I'm in every single day, but now I have to go and stand in front of the auditorium in front of the entire school. Oh, different context, right? So do your exposure in different locations, different times of day, different days of the week, with or without other people, different social contexts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is really, really important. And ideally, you're going to move around, on the exposure hierarchy as well. So moving up and down kind of randomly. So instead of moving up like, okay, I'm gonna start here, and then I'm gonna do a 2, and then a 3, and so on. Say, you know, today I'm gonna start with something that hits me at a 7. Tomorrow I'm gonna do a 1. That being said, it is sometimes easier to start at a low level anxiety inducement rather than a high level, just to build some momentum, just to, you know, kind of the baby steps, and that's okay. You can vary the space between exposure sessions, you know, sometimes twice or more in a day, sometimes daily, sometimes 2 or 3 days in between, and so on. and so on and so on and so on. So it's really kind of important to, I guess, mix it up. Sometimes use the bolus method, sometimes the small chunk method, and we'll talk about that a little bit later this morning. And then use different triggers. So vary which trigger you use in certain category at any given time. So for example, if you have a fear of heights, you could do a spot in your office building, right? Each day. So maybe you go to the 3rd floor, and maybe you go to the top of the parking garage. Maybe you go to a bridge, mix them up. Just kind of, maybe you go up a set of stairs, mix it up different times of the day, just to get a sense of how that is actually going to be different. Tip number 4, work to strengthen the brain, not to make the anxiety go away. Exposure is, as I said, an exercise in building resilience, building strength, and an effort to move forward. It is not a way to stop or arrest anxiety. We identified in session 1 that we can't ultimately completely eradicate anxiety from our lives. So we need to frame each exercise as a challenge to the system, to grow, to stretch, instead of making it an effort to make anxiety go away. This is so important. This is critical, as trying to make our anxiety go away can become its own form of safety behavior, and that can keep the anxiety around even longer. So don't try to desensitize every single anxiety trigger. Rather, use each trigger as an opportunity to gain more strength and flexibility in the brain. Deepen the exposure. So start with individual triggers related to a specific fear. For example, if you have panic disorder, work first on the fear of overheating, flushing, or suffocating, and then move on to other individual triggers like rapid heartbeat, dizziness, and so on. Then start to combine different elements during the exposure session. So you're like going to add, I'm going to work on dizziness, then rapid heart rate, shortness of breath, hotness, suffocation feeling, all at the same time. So we're layering skills. One and after the other. Then, this is a hard one, and the worst case scenario. Not grave, okay? But add in the experiences of actual danger, again, not grave danger, can be a huge bolstering to your exposure exercise. So this is a hard one. If the fear is having panic attacks, you would actually have to have a panic attack. So we can't always do that. If you're afraid of making a mistake in public, you'd actually practice making mistakes in public. Now, I have done this one with clients. This type of practice helps us to change the expectations that we couldn't recover if these things actually did happen. And that's really the principle, right? Changing the outcome, changing our outcome belief. And sometimes this is the only way to prove to ourselves that protecting against these things just isn't worth the effort. It just isn't worthwhile. So try to think of ways to add the worst case scenario into your exposure practice, but be sure to talk to your therapist about this, about when you should do this and how you should do this and how this can be accomplished in a safe way. Okay, that's really important. We're going to limit and eventually remove those safety behaviors. So Katrina, you were asking earlier about safety behaviors. So those safety behaviors signal to our amygdala that there is a danger, and it continues to reinforce that fear, as we discussed before. So the most important safety behaviors to remove are those that we use to try to keep us from feeling the anxiety itself. So for example, if I feel safe, air quotes, from having a panic attack when I have other people in the car with me, I'd eventually need to learn to drive without other people in the car. And there are other safety behaviors that might actually help us stay more connected with the anxiety during exposure. Breathing exercises are an example. So the key in this case would be our intent. Is the safety behavior there to get us away or to help us experience it as fully as possible? Something to think about. So regardless of what other elements you may add during exposure, the key is that you focus, really hone in on the feelings of fear that come up for you in that time. And over time, You might practice the exposure without the breathing exercises in order to feel more flexibility, in order to feel like you have a greater range of options. When planning your exposure, it's really important to pick things you can commit to. So make them convenient, make them things that you can add into your schedule and make it hard to forget them. Schedule them into your day so they don't take a lot of extra work to do. And give yourself every chance you can to follow through, to really get into it. I can't highlight enough how important it is to be prepared for the discomfort. Stay aggressive with it, like drive into the discomfort. Exposure is difficult, it's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it's really difficult at times. After all, if we're going into battle, which is what we're doing, we're battling our own internal conversations, we should expect the enemy to resist us with everything that it has. We're doing battle with our own brain at this point. The main defense that anxiety has is discomfort, and we can expect to feel discomfort during exposure. Bottom line, usually the discomfort is most severe, most intense during the early stages of exposure, right? When we first started. And some people find that the anxiety can peak a bit before it gets better, right? Just like when you've got the flu, you get a little sicker before you get better. The main defense of discomfort is what we must most be prepared for. I know this is coming. I'm ready for it. I'm ready to just keep going through. Our body is trying to get us to give in, right? Trying to get us to just lay back and feel that discomfort and then give up on pushing it. And we know that our best bet is to stay aggressive with it, not listen to what the anxiety is trying to tell us. And we can try to ride that anxiety wave, always remembering that anxiety, as you remember from the first session, anxiety is uncomfortable, but not dangerous. Let that sink in. Anxiety is uncomfortable, but not dangerous. You know, as we discussed earlier, even our unconscious effort to feel better can become its own safety behavior. Why? Well, if anxiety is something that must be changed or fixed, then the amygdala gets the message that it must be bad. And this creates that perpetual fight inside of us, right? And there's no kind of stopping point. It's just endless cycle of reinforcement, right? Which then causes more symptoms, which causes more reinforcement. And it's an awful cycle. So how do we escape that catch-22? This is all about balance at this point, right? We need to find a balance between a desperate attempt to fix anxiety. I have to fix this. I have to make this work. Gosh, should I try something else? And I have to accommodate that anxiety. I always have to do better. I have to be just like this all the time. I have to recreate these exact circumstances every time. Whew. Right? We need to find that middle ground and understand that we can't just make the anxiety go away. It takes practice, observation, deep reflection, learning, challenging, growth, understanding that our anxiety will build our resilience, and that I'm going to, get better at it, and I'm not going to allow the anxiety to hold me back. It's a hard thing to do. It really is. It requires very specific mindsets. So let's take a moment and talk about the mindsets that we need to do exposure. The first one is approach versus avoidance. So don't expect you to stop avoiding things altogether right away. We're humans, right? Like, we're people. However, the general rule with anxiety is that avoidance makes anxiety worse in the long run. We've talked about this. Approaching it, facing it, while scary, actually does lead to new experiences. And those new experiences retrain the brain and change our anxiety over time. And we generally recommend assuming an approach mindset, right? As it applies to our anxiety triggers. And just practice that a little bit each day to undo the restricting effects of avoidance. So that's that whole, Eleanor Roosevelt quote, do something every day that scares you a little, okay? Just a little bit. We want to take an aggressive versus a passive stand with our exposure. So standing up to the tendency, standing up to that tendency to avoid is hard to do. It is. It requires the extra energy that comes from a more aggressive mindset. I'm not talking about being like violent. I'm talking about being firm, standing up to our anxiety bully. And in order to do this, we need to try to access our anger in a very healthy way. So this can be some self-statements that we can use when combined with a little bit of angry physical energy, right? That little bit of burst can help us before and during exposure. So you might say something like, I'm not going to let this anxiety run my life. Bring it on, anxiety. Give me more. I'm not afraid of you. Okay, I'm having like strange conversations in my head. I'm tired of all this work protecting myself. It's time to start living, right? So using those kind of approaches can be really helpful. Use a feeling versus thinking mindset. This is an opportunity to understand that sometimes thinking gets in the way of the natural process of the brain's learning, which is experiential, right? Through experience. So we need to stop thinking so much so that the brain can learn what it needs to do to turn down the anxiety alarm. And this is about focusing our attention into feelings. So one way to do this is to focus on whatever unpleasant sensations are happening in the body and just breathe through them. So if it's a rapid heart rate, tingling, flushing, jaw clenching, what have you, focus on that feeling. Draw attention to that and practice your breathing. When we focus attention on the feelings, this speeds up the process of exposure significantly. And if you get caught in your thoughts, if you get stuck there, just redirect to your body over and over and over. And this can be really helpful in our daily lives to help us get unstuck from repetitive thoughts. So if we get stuck in here, start focusing here. And then really have a mindset of choice versus external locus of control, right? So this is understanding that we cannot control everything outside of us. External locus of control means that people believe they have very little influence on their lives, tend to focus what happens to them versus what they can do. Okay, so this is if you're interested in William Glasser and choice theory, this is really great. One way to turn this around is to remember that we are always making choices. Even inaction is a choice. Regardless of what challenge confronts us, we are always making choices. If we avoid something, adding safety behaviors, those are choices. We are choosing to do so. And we don't have to avoid. We don't have to do safety behaviors. We have chosen to do so. We are choosing to experience the pain of losing the things that we want to experience because of fear. We are choosing that. We are choosing that pain over the pain of moving through the discomfort into what we want. Now, this isn't to suggest that I know what's right for you. You're the expert on your own life. Rather, it's a suggestion that either way, it's a conscious choice. Choosing to sit with the anxiety and allow it to rule our lives, or choosing to push through it and experience change and relearning. And when we get into this mindset, we really get away from that common misconception that avoidance leads to less pain, because we know and understand that we're just choosing a different type of pain. Other mindsets to think about. Oops. A growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Somebody who's in management or leadership may have heard about growth versus fixed mindset. Wack wrote a book called, just a second. It's called Mindset. I'm just trying to think of the parenthetical subtitle is The New Psychology of Success. Right, Mindset, The New Psychology of Success. And she really makes a case in that for the benefit of the growth mindset. When we are in a growth mindset, when we're in that space, we are believing that we are on a path of change, a path of growth, and that it does ultimately involve both ups and downs. In this mindset, in that growth mindset, all experiences, bar none, have the potential to teach us something, especially the failures. And failures are seen as learning opportunities in this case, not a proof of fixed negative traits. They are opportunities for growth. So we accept where we are instead of criticizing ourselves for where we should be. Pain is seen as an indication of growth. Remember, as kids, we talked about growing pains, right? And it's about the building of resilience. And this is so critically important during exposure, which can be both challenging and painful at times. What about embracing versus catastrophizing, right? So one reason that people will avoid feeling anxious is that they believe that stress is dangerous, right? And this was really ingrained in the 1980s when many in the medical field emphasized the impact of stress on a variety of health problems. But since that time, we have actually learned a lot more about stress in like the last, 40 years. Dr. Kelly McGonigal in her book, The Upside of Stress, Why Stress is Good for You, and How to Get Good at It, I just had to think about the title, explains that stress itself is not the thing that is dangerous. Rather, instead, it is our attitude about stress that is challenging and that leads to negative impact on our health. So if we believe that stress is hurting us, that is actually a predictor of whether or not the stress will harm us. Isn't that interesting how powerful the mind is? For those that see stress as a positive, so like growth mindset, stress has very few of these effects. So it's really interesting. So when we embrace the stress and use it to our advantage, we become wiser, stronger, and resilient, which then leads us into resilience and tolerance versus effort to get rid of anxiety. So this mindset is really connected to the others, right? Even within exposure, the efforts to get rid of anxiety interfere with the healing process. And as we've discussed before, this is partially because when we try to get rid of anxiety, we're training the brain that we need to react to it as if it's dangerous, which in turn increases the anxiety alarm, and so on and so on and so on and so on. For this reason, it really serves us to let go. Oh, so hard, right? Let go of the effort to try to fix the anxiety and instead focus on strengthening our resilience, strengthen our ability to tolerate anxiety. And when we do this, we tend to feel better, not through an effort to fix, but rather the willingness to experience the anxiety and learn to not let it take control. You might say, if I am a strong person and something bad happens, I will manage it. It's not worth it to try to keep anything bad from happening. All I'm doing is strengthening my anxiety. Acceptance is another term that fits well in there with resilience and tolerance, and that's a really an important term within the mindfulness modality of therapy, is that acceptance of what we're experiencing is a way to a mindset of commitment to our goals, to our life aims, rather than trying to just feel better. So this is about investing in what is meaningful, what is important, what is critical to us, rather than spending all of our effort on eradicating anxiety, because that's ultimately doomed to failure. The more time we spend trying to rid ourselves of the anxiety, the more we miss out on. There are so many things that can be done to manage anxiety and feel better, which is true. But we must balance this with movement toward, like forward movement toward what is meaningful or enjoyable in our lives. 4 types of mindset that I want to talk about. Curiosity. So approaching things with, well, let's just see what happens, right? Versus rigid hopes and expectations. So it's normal to want to feel better, right? That seems normal. But the focus on feeling better can also take us out of the mindset that calms the amygdala. So it's kind of important to notice that. When we have really rigid expectations or rigid hopes that are focused on the future, it takes us away from the present moment, where the brain has the ability to learn and grow. And learning and growing requires that curiosity mindset. Think about a child. Think about a child observing something for the first time, seeing a butterfly on a flower for the first time. They have no expectations, just a curiosity about what is going to happen next. And learning happens when we're in that mindset, when we have that curious mind, that beginner's mind. And this is a present moment, non-judgmental, completely open state of mind. And holy crow, it's hard to achieve when we're feeling awful. Okay, just I'm going to acknowledge that and validate that. However, if we practice, remember, practice, repetitive, consistent. If we practice taking on this mindset more and more in our daily lives in all aspects, then we may be able to much more effectively apply it when we face anxiety. And this leads us really into process versus product. This mindset is all about, it's not the end point that is important, it's how we get there. It's the journey. It's the building of the skills. It's the building of the strength, the resilience, the tolerance that is important. We can't expect to just arrive at some healthy mental state and just stay there. There is a constant ebb and flow, and we need to constantly be committed to the process of growing, the process of becoming more resilient, stronger. That healthy place that is a fixed point just simply isn't a thing. We need to look at the parts versus sense of self as the only one thing. So this is remembering that your anxiety does not define you, nor is it all of you. And I think sometimes we forget that, right? It's just one part of you that it's doing its job to try to protect you. It just happens to have its own agenda, and maybe it's hyper protective, and that's not defining you as a human. It doesn't concern itself with your goals, with your personality, with your values. Other parts of you are focused on that. And often what happens is our anxiety parts have taken over, and these other parts of us, these other really cool and important and special parts of us, have been ignored. So if you consider that, like, your anxiety is the office of safety, the work safe office, and it's making sure that you are following the guidelines and always staying safe, that's great. But what if there are other departments as well? The Department of Fun and Pleasure, the Department of Freedom, the Department of Career Progression, okay? And each of these departments may have a different opinion about what's important and what you need to focus on. So it's really important for you to take all of the information from all of the offices, all of the departments, not just from the safety department, and remind yourself, anxiety is just one small part of you. It is not all of you. And this requires some serious self-compassion. And those of you who have been in other workshops with me or who follow me on social media recognize that I speak a lot about the importance of self-compassion versus self-criticism. Self-criticism is sometimes the very thing that provokes our anxiety. And then we experience shame, that deep self-criticism, that deep sense of lack of value. And self-compassion is our absolute best defense against this horrible multi-headed monster, this hydra of anxiety. If you want to learn more about self-compassion, I definitely recommend looking up Kristin Neff. She is absolutely like the foremost teacher, researcher, etc. on self-compassion, and she has some really phenomenal work around that. She did a great TED Talk a few years ago about self-compassion, and it's a really great way to combat anxiety. So we're getting there. So what do we do during exposure? What do we do? Well, we use that aggressive mindset. Use this to inspire a bit of fight toward the avoidance and the anxiety feelings. We say to the avoidance, or to the anxiety, come on, bring it on, let's do this. And keep in mind, you will have periods when that tendency toward avoidance will return, okay? And if that happens, that's okay. Try to inspire that fight response again and again, that sense of, I'm gonna do this. Use your mindfulness skills to name your emotions, name your body experiences. Be non-reactive, non-judgmental, simply experience the thing without an effort to change it. Observe, describe the emotions, describe the physical sensations that come up from moment to moment. And this one way to do this is to use that SUDS scale. where we covered earlier, you know, the thermometer. Give numbers to the intensity of your emotions, to the intensity of your sensations. Describe the sensations themselves. I have a pain in my stomach, heat in my head, tension in my neck. These are examples of how we might name it non-judgmentally. Whatever comes up, name it. Notice it and name it. Redirect your attention away from your thoughts. Good or bad, doesn't matter. Just redirect. So during exposure, our conscious thoughts don't help the amygdala learn new patterns. Okay, we won't learn the new patterns necessary to reduce anxiety. In fact, if we spend our time during exposure actively trying to think positive thoughts, it can reduce the effectiveness. So we're going to use those cognitive skills to help us, right? Focus on that mindful awareness. And then be curious. Just see what happens. And this one's really hard because we want to plan, we want to prepare. Do our best to let go of expectations. Do our best to stay in that mindset of, okay, pay attention. What's up next? What's going to happen? And then use the resources that will help you in the situation. Slow diaphragmatic breathing, mindfulness, practicing letting go, you know, that progressive muscle relaxation. The key is to not use these strategies to make the anxiety go away, because that would be a safety behavior, but rather to help you feel your emotions, feel the feelings, and experience the body sensations more deeply. And I know that can feel crazy uncomfortable. Kristen Neff, N-E-F-F, the self-compassion author. So the different phases, oops, we went the wrong way, of exposure. So we can get into different ways to practice exposure skills. And in a perfect world, we would be like ready to just tackle it head on, boom, boom, right away. However, let's talk about reality. We probably wouldn't make terribly efficient progress if we did that, okay? So we probably need to adjust our approach based on the individual, and everybody's going to be at a different point in their journey, all right? You need to start at the place that feels appropriate for you. So here's some examples of some phases. So like a higher phase, more active, quicker to change phase would be what we call the bolus method. This would be doing exposure on very specific targets on the fear hierarchy in as much as 30 to 60 minute chunks at a time. Like, that's a lot, right? So that would be very, very specific. And that would be if you're already well stabilized, if you already have some good resiliency skills, that would be a great place to start. The smaller chunk method, this is for, you know, small amounts of time, but through multiple times of the day. For example, if you're dealing with contamination fears, germs or dirt. Something on your hierarchy of, and do that exposure for a few minutes every hour. Touch a doorknob, for example. This would be a small chunk method. In the flow of daily life exposure, you might start looking at your avoidance in the context of anxiety triggers that are already in the flow of your daily life. So this would be moving toward your life aims, being awareness of the anxiety's effort to restrict you. So being tuned into this, and little by little, chip away at that avoidance. Consider moving toward more structured practice as you get more comfortable over time. For example, if you've been in a car accident on the way to work and you feel compelled to avoid the scene of the accident, right? You might start driving by the scene every day. That's a small flow of daily life. It's in route already, and you're just adding it in, okay? And then there's that preparation for exposure. So this is like you're just getting started. You're just getting into practicing your mindset. You're just really starting to learn your anxiety, understand it, understanding your own triggers, practicing awareness of those triggers, you know, logging them like we talked about for a week. Practicing emotional regulation strategies such as mindfulness and so on. So it's kind of like the scale, the continuum of how you can do exposure. And the top end of the continuum, the structured methods, tend to be a little more efficient, okay? And if you're looking to benefit quickly and you believe you can actually manage it, those are going to be the place to start. But, excuse me, if you're feeling a little more tentative, if you're just not quite sure, you may want to start experimenting with exposure in other ways. You might want to think about starting at a different point of a continuum. And it's really important to bear in mind that your anxiety will likely never allow you to feel that exposure is going to be comfortable, and it won't. And if you're waiting for the time that feels comfortable, you're going to wait a really long time, probably indefinitely. But that being said, the most important thing is to start. Doesn't matter where. Start, and then get engaged in the process of learning and practicing in any way that works for you. So we're really trying to find that balance between challenging yourself, which is what it takes to retrain the brain, and not becoming overwhelmed to the point that exposure is making life worse. So really it's up to you, because again, you're the expert on your life, to determine if, when, and how you decide to practice exposure. And again, as I mentioned, it's a great thing to do with your therapist. Once you begin practicing exposure, it's really important and helpful to track your progress, to really tune into what it's looking like. Remember the units of distress scale? We talked about the SUDS. Well, you can use the SUDS scale to really rate how much anxiety comes up during any given exercise. So rate the anxiety at the beginning, the middle, and the end. So let's look at Bill's public speaking again. This is the type of progress that we might expect to see for someone who is consistently, remember consistently, practicing, practice, a specific exposure exercise. You may notice that the middle levels, I'm pointing at my screen, you can't see that because we're not in the same room together. The middle levels are often the highest because it takes some time for the anxiety to come down. So we start the exposure exercise and it goes up, and then we do this, okay? So it's really important to tune in to how that's working for you. So this is the contamination one, right? So we can do multiple small chunk exposures for things that are harder to do for a full hour. So Jane has a diagnosis of OCD and a specific fear of contamination. So she is practicing exposing herself to a rag that has been in contact with a door handle. And she's doing that once per hour, all day long. And you're going to notice that in each of these examples, there are times when the anxiety will come down and go up again. And sometimes the anxiety starts way high and comes down consistently. And it's important that we record our experience this way so we can see that anxiety tends to change over time, that it isn't always here or here or here. How this happens is not as important as our practice of focusing on the ability to tolerate the fear. Okay, so it doesn't matter so much how it happens, but that it does, and that we focus on it. So here's an example. Here's what we're going to do. This is a fancy external cue exposure. It's just like a fancy way to describe exposure to situations, places, objects, animals, people in our environment that make us feel anxious. Okay, that's all it is. It's also called, for those of you who have done some therapy around this, in vivo exposure, which means exposure in real life. So let's look at Bill again with his public speaking and look at it at one step at a time. So step one, Bill picks a trigger. He decides he really wants to beat this fear of public speaking, and he's focused on his target and commits to designing an exposure plan. So that's one. He creates his fear hierarchy. He lists all the ways that he could purposely trigger his anxiety. He thinks about different ways to make public speaking situations more or less difficult. He creates, excuse me. He, excuse me, sorry. So he determines that, maybe it's speaking in front of a large crowd, maybe a large crowd of professionals who are experts on the topic on which he's speaking, and so on and so on. And so he does that fear hierarchy. Then he rates the hierarchy. Okay, well, this one is really bad. Well, this one's not so much. This one's maybe a 6. Okay, so he does that. And he goes through that whole process. Step 4, he starts the exposure. Bill picks an item from the list that's in the 5 to 6 range. Okay, and he begins by speaking in front of his friends, people he with, 1 hour each day for 1 week. And he tracks his progress using SUDS. And he also follows the rules of exposure. Remember we talked about the formula, the ingredients that are required? He follows the formula. Then at the middle sessions of his exposure, when his anxiety has come down to a 3 or less on the SUDS consistently for 3 or 4 days, he moves on to the next highest item on his hierarchy. Okay. And he goes to a Toastmasters group and starts practicing in front of a group of people with whom he feels much less comfortable. When he then gets comfortable with that, or he habituates to this level of anxiety, this exposure, then he moves on to something else, speaking in front of his superiors or to professionals or experts, and so on and so on and so on. And he continues that way. And finally, he does what's called the ending exposure. He continues the practice of exposure for about 12 solid weeks, changing the exposure exercise about once per week as he moves through the hierarchy. And after this, he decides to continue practice public speaking, but less formally, in order to maintain his gains, the changes that he's experienced, and to refine his tolerance and resiliency skills. So that's how we can do this process. So I'm being mindful of time. I'm going to skip ahead to, I was going to talk specifically about panic disorder, but I think we'll skip ahead to getting close to the end in the interest of time. And we're going to look at some barriers to exposure treatment. And if you have questions about specifically about panic disorder, we can talk about that after. So here's the example of what that exercise looks like broken down, the one we just did with Bill. And let's have a look at our barriers. So many people, and if you're feeling nervous about this, you're not alone. Many people find exposure treatment difficult, okay? And there's some barriers along the way that make it really hard to follow through. So it's important to understand what these possible barriers are and find ways to work around them. So if we don't, exposure therapy is not likely to work. It's not going to be helpful. So some of the most common ones: I don't have enough time. Anybody? Anybody? This is too much homework, okay? And it is true. It is absolutely true that exposure takes a commitment of time and energy in order to work well. And, you know, if there was evidence that exposure would work in less amounts of time, then yeah, that's what would be recommended. But as I mentioned earlier, repetitive, prolonged exposure practice. So you might ask yourself, like, how much time does anxiety take from you each day? How much time? How much time does it take from you each week? How much time does anxiety take from you each month, each year, over a lifetime? It could very well be that a commitment to doing the exposure homework, the time commitment now, could save you a lot of time in the future. Another barrier that people express is that, you know, these exercises, these exposure exercises, they don't fit my lifestyle. Okay, sure. A really important aspect of exposure therapy is finding ways to make those exercises convenient. Remember I said that about an hour ago? Make it convenient. Design them in ways that will increase the chance of you doing them, right? So this includes ways of reminding you to do them, whether it's putting it in your digital calendar, your paper calendar, having an accountability partner, etc. Plan times to do the homework when you're not going to be bothered. You have all the necessary resources when you have the time. If you were doing exposure around driving at night, well, you would need to plan to do the exposure at times when you can be sure you have a car, and probably at night, right? So you need to find ways to make it fit into your lifestyle. Some people will say that they feel terrible when doing the exposure. I don't want to experience this. Yeah, Exposure it sucks sometimes. It's not comfortable. We actually need to feel the anxiety during the practice session. And when the anxiety gets worse, it's a pretty good sign that the exposure is working. And we just need to stick it out to the end of the session. If you're going into exposure hoping to not feel any anxiety during the process, it's probably not the right treatment for you. And that's okay. It's not, CBT and anxiety treatment is not one size fits all. Some of you might say that, sometimes you do safety behaviors and you don't even know you're doing them. And that's pretty common, right? It's something that often comes up in exposure treatment. As the treatment progresses, our goal is to learn more and more, be more in tune with, more attuned to our experience, to understand how we might be fueling the anxiety with our safety behaviors. The more we are aware of them, the more we are checked into ourselves and our experience, the sooner we can extinguish those anxiety fires, those fuels. And this is when a therapist can be really beneficial because they're objective, they're an outside observer who can identify any potential covert, right, or hidden safety behaviors or rituals. So this is a great opportunity to work with a professional on this. You might say that you hate having anxiety and you don't want to have to keep doing this. Preach, right? It's true. Especially once your treatment has gained some momentum, you may feel discouraged. You may feel like, I'm going to have to do this forever. I'm going to have to fight my anxiety on the long term. And that's, I feel that. I understand. And I understand that desire for anxiety to go away forever. I get that. However, we also know that giving in to the impulses to protect, to avoid, to otherwise stay comfortable can make our anxiety worse and can keep us from achieving our goals, from truly enjoying our life. Accepting that anxiety exists, accepting that it truly is part of life is necessary before we can do something about it. And then the other barrier that people will bring up is that, it's just not working. It's not working. Before making that judgment, before making a judgment about whether or not exposure is working, be sure that you are following the exposure formula to make sure you're following all the rules. Because if you're not, if you're only doing it halfway, it's not going to work. It's so critical. We have to do it the right way. So take a moment and think about what barriers you might have. Think about and write down any possible barriers to completing exposure therapy for one of your most impairing anxiety triggers. Think about that. What are the things that you see as barriers? And what comes up? What comes up for you, right? Think about that. You may feel like your anxiety is constantly making choices for you. Exposure therapy is about choices. It's about the ability to choose what to do based on our goals and life aims instead of allowing anxiety to direct us into what is safest or least anxiety provoking. We have choices all day, every day. And one of the hardest choices we make is whether or not to listen to the anxiety alarm that is trying to keep us safe, even misguidedly. And we know now that making choices based on anxiety ultimately serves to make the anxiety stronger. So it makes sense to have a way to counter this anxiety when it comes up during the exposure techniques. So in our choices, we can say, that's just my anxiety. I know it's not dangerous, right? That's okay. All right, anxiety, go ahead, stay around. I'm just going to go about and do my business. I'm going to do my thing. I'm just going to live my life. Yeah, that's okay. It's true. The plane might crash, okay? Or whatever the fear may be. I can't control that. That first step involves recognizing that the anxiety is separate from us, that our brain is trying to convince us to do something that will hurt us in the long run. Step 2 is an attempt to further accept that anxiety at that moment and resist the urge to avoid or protect ourselves. And in the third step, we really just ramp it up, the approach, by doing a mini exposure to the specific content of that fear. What we need to remember is that anxiety is uncomfortable, that we can bring it on. Create some self-statements that allow you to adjust your attitude. Remember to stay aggressive with this, right? Have that assertive mindset. Anxiety is waiting for us to become defensive. And when we do this, it tries to take over. If we stay assertive, if we stay aggressive with our anxiety, if we're in that, I'm ready for you, this helps us keep the anxiety from coming back in full force. So, where are we? We know that we have different anxiety triggers. Exposure and desensitization is just one of the many skills that we have to combat those triggers. Exposure and desensitization work best when we know what the triggers are and we understand that we are currently avoiding those triggers or that we are using safety behaviors to combat them. The goal of exposure is to expose ourselves to whatever it is that's being avoided in order to meet our life goals and learn to tolerate and respond effectively to the anxiety. We can decide whether or not exposure is right for us by determining and understanding the ways that anxiety impacts our lives. We understand desensitization, that over time, through experience, we can make our brains less sensitive to certain anxiety triggers. This is achieved through inhibitory learning. We know that we can begin our exposure by creating a fear hierarchy, using the SUDS scale, the thermometer, to rate the difficulty of each possible exercise. And we learned that exposure practice requires repetition and consistency, which is really hard, without engaging in safety behaviors or avoidance. And with a concentrated effort to violate the expectations that the amygdala has for what will potentially happen. When we look at exposure therapy, we understand that the skills covered today can be used to help us combat anxiety in conjunction with other skills. Typically, exposure is used in conjunction with those other skills to gain more ground, to have more traction. And next week, we'll talk some more about some of those. But as we are just about at 1 o'clock, we should wrap up the day, and I will open it up for questions. I have to leave. See you next week. Super. Okay. The slides are not available. No, they are. The video is available on the CMHA YouTube channel, so you can review it and pause it at your leisure. So the slides are not available, but the video is. Panic attacks, sure. Very briefly, okay, we'll talk about panic, as I know a lot of folks have panic. So, sorry, my dogs just are going a little wild here. Let's talk about panic. One of the things that's really important to remember is that we can combat panic by something called interoceptive exposure exercises. And this is very specific to panic. So you might encourage exercises around certain things. So for example, if you have a symptom of rapid heartbeat, okay, you might choose to run on the spot or up and down for several minutes, then take a 1-minute break and do this sequence for 8 times. And again, these kinds of exercises, you want to have medical clearance to do that. So talk to your primary care physician or your nurse practitioner around this, because we're going to be inducing some of the physical symptoms, okay? If your symptom is rapid heart rate, you're going to run on the spot, run up and down the stairs for a minute, then take a break and do this 8 times. If your symptom is breathlessness or smothering feelings, so we're talking panic attacks specifically, hold your breath for 30 seconds. Then breathe normally for 30 seconds. This 15 times. Breathe through a narrow straw for 2 minutes. Then breathe normally for 1 minute. Do this 5 times. Sit with your head covered by a heavy blanket or a coat. This is a way to induce that feeling of breathlessness or smothering. If your symptom is dizziness, spin slowly in a swivel chair, right, for a minute. Then take a 1-minute break and do this 8 times. Shake your head from side to side for 30 seconds. Take a 30-second break. Do this several times. While sitting, bend over and place your head between your legs for 30 seconds. Again, I'm going to reiterate that all of these should be done with the clearance of your physician. So you've practiced these ways to induce the experience of panic. And there, you could look at choking, the gag reflex, derealization, feelings that that things aren't real, any of these. What you're going to ultimately do is kind of put them all together. Okay, so we're going to put those all together. And I'm going to go back. How many slides am I going to go back here? I'm going to go back here. So this is how you would do the interoceptive exercises for panic. So you would choose a trigger, say dizziness, for example, and you're going to choose an interoceptive exercise to trigger it. You're going to rate the hierarchy. You're going to start the exposure, and so on. When you're doing these exercises around panic, I do highly encourage physician clearance and doing these ones with a therapist to make sure that you're doing them appropriately, that you're doing them safely, okay? Because you are inducing those physical symptoms related to panic. And I can see if I can go back here a little. So for example, these are the ones I was talking about, rapid heart rate, breathlessness, dizziness, lightheadedness, inducing the choking feeling, the gag reflex, derealization, trembling, shaking, sweating, tightness in the throat. These are all very common panic attack symptoms. And in this exercise here, this is what we're recreating in order to get exposure. And in this scenario, Janet, sorry, this for about 10 weeks. So this is not something that happens right away. This is a long-term practice that you're going to do with your therapist in order to get moving up the hierarchy of your panic symptoms. So does that answer your question, I hope? Okay, other questions? Thank you, have a good day. How do you work on checking your compulsion? I'd have to have some more specifics around that. By what you mean by checking your compulsion? Do you mean, good, thank you, Heather. I'm not sure what you mean by checking your compulsion. Do you mean checking in with what you're experiencing? Checking in with a behavior? You give me a little more clarity, I can probably answer your question. No? If you're doubtful about something, then you have to check it, like a fact checking, or like checking to see if the lights are on or off. Is that what you mean? If you're checking, like to make sure that you've turned off the stove, for example? Okay, super. Okay, so we're going to go back 2 slides. We didn't get into OCD, but we certainly can for a moment. And I'm going to apologize. My family is home. So they're going to be coming crashing in, just so you hear them. So if we look at exposure for OCD, this is a very common more common than people think. Compulsions are also called rituals, but they are actually examples of safety behaviors, right? They are safety behaviors that make a person feel less anxious in the moment. So when we most often think about OCD, we think about anxiety around contamination, washing hands frequently and so on, but it has all kinds of forms. So the most common and beneficial CBT for OCD, that was funny to say, cognitive behavioral therapy for obsessive compulsive disorder, is called exposure and response prevention. And so you already know now about exposure, but the response prevention part involves resisting the compulsions. And this is preventing or blocking our impulses to give in and do the ritual. So this is a hard one, and I really recommend working with a therapist who is trained in ERP to help you with that. But for example, if you tend to check things, irons, stoves, locks, the garage door, because you feel anxious about the possibility that it's still on, that it's unlocked, plugged in, etc., you're constantly checking yourself. So this would involve creating doubt, purposely creating doubt about whether or not you've locked something. This would be your exposure. And resisting the urge to check. That's the response prevention. So you would be working to see your OCD as something separate from you. Again, like anxiety is not me. It's just a part of me. OCD is not me. It's just a part of me. It's the OCD telling me to check those lights, telling me to check that switch, telling me to check that plug. If you practice, in this example, ERP for 60 minutes a day, this is how it works. You have to remember that OCD is not rational, right? Those compulsions are not rational. They are not something that is from the prefrontal cortex. So OCD is a little bit different from other anxiety disorders in that the person who is experiencing it knows that it may not be rational and that it doesn't make sense, and may try to reassure themselves that it's happening, but your brain just continues to signal the alarm anyway. You take pictures. Okay, so that's a safety behavior. Yeah, that's definitely a safety behavior. So it really doesn't help to rationalize when it comes to OCD. In fact, when we do this, it actually gets worse, right? So finding ways to challenge those safety behaviors is really important. And that safety behavior of checking or taking the photographs is actually a fuel to the anxiety. So a big part of ERP is learning to tolerate the uncertainty. And that's the big challenge in those compulsions, right? Is to tolerate the uncertainty that is common for other people in daily life. And if you have OCD and you really want help, I definitely recommend that you don't do exposure therapy on your own, that you work with a mental health professional who has experience with ERP, and that you really do this in a very safe, controlled environment. And I think I don't know if that helps you, Austin, or not. I hope it does. Hi, Katrina. Yeah, the other panelist is correct. We don't actually have a lot of time to answer other questions because that is a very specific situation and maybe a little too specific for the content of today's session. I would encourage you to speak specifically with your psychologist, with your family. And if you have more questions, please feel free to direct message, and we can go with it there. All right, so we are just about at 1 o'clock, which is the end of our time. If there's no other questions, I will wrap up the session, and I will look forward to seeing you all next week for our final session, where we will be talking on our fourth and final session. And just as a note, for those of you who are interested, starting on Wednesday mornings on the CMHA of New Brunswick Facebook page, I will be doing a 15 to 20 minute Facebook Live every Wednesday morning on topics related to kind of what it feels like to be reintegrating into the economy, getting reconnected after COVID-19. So I hope you all have a lovely weekend. This is Tuesday, a lovely week, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Take care, everyone.